The history of ancient Egypt has changed fundamentally over the last 200 years. Egypt is one of the longest living countries in a way, in the sense that the chunk between the Mediterranean and Aswan has always regarded itself as being a single thing. And there are very few other nations which can quite have that kind of longevity.
Okay, so I want to talk about Nefertiti. Why was she an important figure to know? Why do 8-year-olds around the world know that name?
The female pharaoh Hatshepsut, she was held up as being a peace-loving ruler. Partly, I think, simply because she was a woman. Oh no, she's a woman, she's nice and peaceful. No, she isn't actually. One of the things that was quite shocking, though, in that discovery, was the discovery of human sacrifice during that period. This expression of royal power over everybody else, sublimated by taking loads of people with you to the grave.
Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, I have Aidan Dodson, who's a professor at the University of Bristol and is an author of some 30 books, most recently, The Libyan Pharaohs of Egypt. Aidan, welcome to the series.
Good morning.
Good morning. You're not Egyptian. That you probably get this question all the time. It's hard to find a 10-year-old out there who's not interested in Egypt. Ancient Egypt. When did you decide, okay, I'm going to write 30 books about ancient Egypt?
Well, I got interested in ancient Egypt when I was about 7 or 8. I went to join the local library, found books with mummies and things in them, typical child sort of morbid curiosity. And then when it came to going to choose what to do at university, I thought, well, am I going to do something sensible like business studies, or am I going to do what I'm interested in, Egyptology? So I did, and sort of 4 decades later, professor of Egyptology, author, and so on. It was never really planned. It sort of happened.
Yeah. I want to, it's so funny. Every now and then you look at these books for kids about a subject that people kind of stop studying. Most people stop studying, like dinosaurs or stuff like that. And you wonder, how good are those books? So how good are the books that present ancient Egypt to 8-year-olds around the world? Do they tell a story that's a little misleading, or do they tell the story that's sort of right on the head?
They tend to tell a story which is about 50 years out of date, because...
So what is that story?
Well, the story on the face of it is basically the same. It's the subtleties which differ. The point is, we now understand more about how sort of the religion works and so on and so forth. But also, when you're presenting something for sort of 8 or 10-year-olds, you've got to really, really simplify it down. So there are certain individuals in history are sort of caricatured in a way which we wouldn't do today. But broadly, it's not wrong. It's just that once you at that kind of level, you're trying to just give the basics. So it's okay, but you've got to be quite careful about when you sort of go down into it.
Yeah. Okay. Basic question for you. When was ancient Egypt?
If we define ancient Egypt as being the period where we basically have the same language, constitution, religion, we're talking about a period from about 3000 BC to probably about 300 AD. Because that's when Christianity really starts to bite, and the religious and linguistic side of things starts to erode. But in big handfuls, 3000 BC to about 300 AD.
And for that 3,000-year gap, or 3,000-year period, did the residents of the place that we think of as ancient Egypt, did they think of themselves as being one empire? Did they think, they didn't think ancient Egypt, but did they think of themselves as, this is a 3,000-year long stretch and we're killing it?
Yeah, they basically regard themselves as being Egyptians. And in fact, Egypt is one of the longest living countries in a way, in the sense that the chunk between the Mediterranean and Aswan has always regarded itself as being a single thing. And there are very few other nations which can quite have that kind of longevity. Of course, the advantage is it's all held together by the Nile. Egypt is effectively the Nile and the land and a few kilometers of land either side of that. So therefore, it's got very, very easily definable boundaries. But yes, it's very clearly that throughout that period, the inhabitants of that regard themselves as a very specific thing and distinct from the people who lived on the other side of the Sinai in Syria, Palestine, or further to the west in Libya, or further to south in Nubia, which is largely modern Sudan.
Yeah. Okay, I want to set the scene a little bit. And as I mentioned in the intro, you've written, 30 some books about Egypt, some of the major figures, some of the periods that maybe are a little less well known. So I kind of want to start at the beginning. How did the empire or the civilization of ancient Egypt begin? What did it take the place of, and when did it coalesce into a society that spoke the same language and had the same religion and had the same sort of governance structure?
Basically, during prehistory, Egypt seems to start off as being a sort of loose coalition of villages and so on. And as far as we can trace it archaeologically, it seems that gradually over a period of centuries, those isolated towns, villages and whatever started to coalesce into, certainly in the south, a single political entity. We're not quite so sure what's happening in the north, but probably the same kind of thing. And then as we run up to about 3000 BC, that southern kingdom starts becoming literate and then takes over the rest. So as far as we can tell, the process is that the south becomes a political thing and then expands to take on the north. So
when you say south, you're talking about as far south as Nubia, or what part?
We're probably talking about the chunk from, let's say, the Fayum Oasis down to Aswan, because generally speaking, the Egyptians themselves regarded Aswan as being the cutoff point. So you've got something which is probably growing out of from Aswan north to somewhere in the middle of the country. We can't really say where that boundary is precisely. But then around 3000, there seems to be a conscious decision to take over the north. And that is commemorated by a couple of carved items which have been found in the south. And from that point onwards, Egypt effectively becomes a single entity. Although at various points during its history, there are points of breakdown and it splits up again. But always there is the trajectory is for the country, say at least from Aswan to the Mediterranean, to be a single thing.
Yeah. And how did it, you have a book about the first pharaohs. Who was the first pharaoh? Who establishes themselves as sort of the first ruler of this land?
It looks like it's a king known as Narmer, because he's the king who we have a representation of conquering the north. So it's assumed that this piece, which is a large stone palette, was created as a commemoration of that unification. Although interestingly enough, in sort of later tradition, the unifier of Egypt is known as Menes or Meni, and we think that probably is Narmer. But in later tradition, a lot of the early pharaohs are given a rather different name from the one which we have from archaeological remains, because the standardized form of how to name a pharaoh doesn't happen for a few centuries after unification. So it looks like when we're getting to the point where there is now a standard set of titulary, that historians working then, and this is 2500 BC, are then sort of back engineering some of the earlier pharaohs so they fit into that picture. So it looks like one of the names of Narmer was Men, and that became Menes or Meni in later tradition.
Yeah. What was can you help, do you have a good sense of what society looked like at the time, and connections? Empires have relationships with neighbors, and those early centuries, I should say. It's a crazy thing to say, but what was daily life like for people then?
One suspects actually it was not much different from what it was like in the 19th century AD, because the country was largely an agricultural one. Pretty well 95% of the population were all involved in the annual agricultural cycle. So actually, there's differences in ideologies and politics, but basically the life didn't change much between, 10,000 BC and the 19th century AD. So the vast majority of people are just simply minding their fields, reaping their harvests, paying their taxes to whoever is then the government, and so on and so forth. And again, and then beyond that, the sort of top 5% are the literate elite, who are then managing everything else. And in particular, what they're doing is managing the agricultural surplus, which is then what pays for what we would call civilization. So it's the agricultural surplus which then creates temples, pyramids, and all those kinds of things. But actually, at the ground level, if you like, it's a typical peasant society living, cultivating the land.
Yeah. And what was the center of power? Was it Cairo and Giza, or was it in the south? What was the center of sort of political life?
Pretty well for the whole of Egyptian history, the political centre is in the north, a place called Memphis, which, according to at least later legend, was founded by Menes, the Unifier of Egypt, to be the new capital of Egypt. And Memphis is basically just opposite Cairo. So it seems that, generally speaking, the political centre of gravity of Egypt is always going to be at that point. And the point about it is it's where the Nile Valley turns into the Nile Delta. And the Delta and the Nile Valley have always been culturally different things, because the way you manage them and everything else is different. So although there are certain points in Egyptian history where the capital, the royal residence, is in the south, it doesn't last very long, and fairly rapidly the political centre moves back up to Memphis, or possibly as satellite towns in the southern delta. But basically, Memphis, and the Cairo region has always been where you run Egypt from.
Can I ask you a question? I'm just going to share my screen on and off throughout the interview, because I want to talk about some of these people. It's hard to ask you questions about like the personality of some of these rulers from, 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. But you've written books about these people. So I'm curious, what were these early pharaohs like? Do we have a sense of,
Not at all. Basically, what I tend to be talking about is what happened. The idea of being able to get some kind of feel for anything about the personality of almost any ancient Egyptian is almost impossible. There's a couple where we might have some ideas, but those are effectively storytelling. They're not really based on any kind of fact. We just don't have the kind of sort of personal memoirs we have even from medieval Europe and so on, where you actually can get some kind of idea about what Henry VIII was like, or so on and so forth. With these ancient individuals, we simply haven't got that kind of thing. And most people's attempts in writing history to give sort of motivations or characters are effectively they're writing fiction.
Yeah.
It's just the fact that some of the people who are writing it have a professor something or other, and that's then and that gives it more credibility than just sort of a novelist. That is one of the biggest problems. In virtually no case have we got real data to allow us to know what these people were like. We can say what they did, which might be able to infer, but that's again, you're taking it a long way away from what somebody who actually knew them might have said about them. And of course, what does survive is what these people wanted posterity to know about them. So therefore, there's a huge amount of spin doctoring going on in what we've got, and what we've got represents only a tiny proportion of what once existed. So there's all those kinds of problems if you're just trying to say what was somebody like. Somebody who conquers a large chunk of Syria, Palestine, but does suggest they probably have some kind of imperial ambitions. But trying to take it beyond that becomes very difficult. And we start then having a danger of reading our own prejudices into things.
Of
For
course.
example, the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. Up until quite recently, she was held up as being a peace-loving ruler. Partly, I think, simply because she was a woman. We actually have got texts, though, which actually talk about her actually being on the battlefield personally and looting the bodies of her enemies. So, but that's only really sort of come in quite recently because everybody's been, oh no, she's a woman, she's nice and peaceful. No, she isn't actually.
Yeah. So what do we know? Let's stick with the first pharaohs, and then I kind of want to go through later on. What do we know about those early centuries, the unification, and how do we know it? Like, how does an Egyptologist find their actual things to read?
Okay, well, the reason why we know about the unification, well, the first thing, it was always a traditional thing. Even in ancient times, there was the idea that the country had been brought together, and there's always a duality to do with the country. The north and the south are always regarded as subtly different things. Royal titulary sometimes talks about the king of the north and south, all that. So we know that dichotomy. I mentioned there that the key document for the unification is a thing called the Narmer Palette. So it's a palette, and on one side of it you've got the king smiting an enemy, who is labelled as from the north, and on the other side he's wearing a crown which is later associated with the north with various enemies. So it looks, that is a commemoration of that. Beyond that, most of our evidence comes from
this one.
That's the one. Yes, the one which we've got. You're showing here. That's the Narmer Palette. Yeah, now found at Hierakonpolis in the south of Egypt, which was, as far as we can tell, the original capital of the Southern Kingdom. Found in 1898. Now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and since the moment it was found, it was seen as being a crucial document in Egyptian history.
How does this get read? I mean, like, what am I looking at exactly, do you think?
Okay, if you're looking at the left-hand side of it, you've got a man wearing a tall conical hat. He is Narmer, he is the king. And what he's doing is he's holding an enemy by the hair and about to whack his brains out with the club, which is in his right hand. Now, we know that this person is from the south because above his head is this. It's not exactly hieroglyphs. It's not exactly hieroglyphs. At this point, we're just trying to get into the whole hieroglyphs are becoming a thing. But this, what you've got there is that you've got a head which is on what is a hieroglyph for marshland. So that sort of rectangle with the things. And then on top of it is a hawk, who is the personification of Egyptian kingship, who has got a rope which has been put through the nose of that. So it's basically, we should probably read this as saying, the Horus king is taking captive the marshlands, and the marshlands are the Nile Delta in the north. And then the little figure below him, but below that is a personification of the north, which is being basically whacked over the head by the king. And this becomes a really, really standardized motif for royal power. This is the first time we have it around 3000 BC. We're still seeing Roman emperors being shown like this over 3,000 years later. So, and this is the icon, if you like, of kingship. And it's the icon of violent kingship. So we often find that seen on the gateways of temples, the bits which are facing out, which ordinary people can see. And on the other side of it, what we've got at the top there is Narmer, but wearing a different crown, which is known as the red crown, which is regarded as the crown of the north. And he's then got a series of standards, and then there are headless enemies on the right. And then below that, this sort of fantastic long necked beast, which is something which doesn't carry on into later Egyptian art. It's part of very, very early Egyptian art and is also linked with Mesopotamia, where we also have that. It looks like that may well be the two parts of the country being bound together, because there's a later motif without long neck beast, but the idea of the two parts of the country being bound together is an icon, which again we find through Egyptian history. Then at the bottom there, you've got a bull, and we know from later on that the bull can be a personification of the king. He's bashing down the walls of a fortified settlement, while also treading on the enemy. So there's lots and lots of victory icons here,
Yeah.
and the juxtaposition of a king of the south whacking the north on the head effectively, and then shown in a sort of triumphal procession with the crown of the north. That's all been taken together to regard this as being a commemoration of that act of unification.
Yeah. Amazing. Can I ask you what are the stakes like after this was discovered? In 1897, 1898, it's discovered. What actually are the ripple effects of that type of discovery on the academy, on the way we think about the world, on on how we sort of organize our own societies? It seems like a really big discovery. I'm curious what that actually affects is.
Yeah, when you actually read some of these stuff being written around this period, it's quite clear this is a seismic shift. We suddenly have got 200 or 300 years worth of history which we had no idea of, and then potentially thousands of years of prehistory which we had nothing to do with. So there's a certain amount of just trying to work out how it all works. And to a degree, this stuff is still so new, we're not fully understanding it. For example, the hieroglyphs at this point are still proto-hieroglyphs, so we can't sort of read these things. And for a while, we're having to look at some of this stuff through the lens of some of the legendary stuff from later on as well. So but it's remarkable how quickly everybody gets their head around it, actually, that sometimes in academia, sort of new ideas, new reconstructions can take a while to bed in. But all this stuff, which is so clearly, there was not a huge amount of interpretation required. We've got the tombs of these kings.
Yeah.
We know where they fit into that, so therefore we can then take our history back. One thing which was quite shocking, though, in that discovery was discovery of human sacrifice during that period, because in most of Egyptian history there is no evidence whatsoever for human sacrifice, unless you think in terms of sort of ceremonial execution of enemies as being human sacrifice.
Yeah, war.
But we're talking here about these but during those first century or so of Egyptian history, the king's tombs are surrounded by the graves of people who all seem to have been buried at the same time as him.
Wow.
And that reaches a peak about 3 generations after unification. And then it starts to trickle away again. And then sort of by 150 years or so after the unification, they're gone completely. There's no trace of them anymore in royal burials. It presumably says something about the confidence or something to do with the way that the new regime is thinking about itself, and then how it then changes and this no longer becomes a thing. What's interesting, though, is a few centuries later in southern Iraq, in Mesopotamia, that you also find royal tombs for a short period with large numbers of human sacrifices. So it does seem possibly that there's something about the earliest years of a monarchy's evolution whereby this expression of royal power over everybody else is sublimated by taking loads of people with you to the grave.
Okay, I want to talk about the sort of the pyramid generations, or pyramid kingdoms, or dynasties rather. Who's the first pharaoh that emerges? And tell me if you think this is not the right framework for me even to be thinking about it. I'm sort of jumping from pharaoh to pharaoh to pharaoh, but maybe that's not even the right way to think about it.
Yeah. I think most of us probably would regard the pyramid era as a thing because it comes about directly after the end of what seems to be a civil war at the end of the Second Dynasty. So I think it actually is a useful thing to think about, because you go from the end of the civil war with Kharsekemwy having apparently won this, and then he builds typical mud brick, tomb out of mud brick. His son and successor, Djoser, builds the first pyramid, which is also the first stone-built building probably in the world, which does suggest there is a significant shift conceptually, economically, technologically, and all those kinds. That's the step pyramid, yeah. And what's interesting about it is it's built of stone. However, the stones are the same size as mud bricks used to be. And then as you move through the next few generations of pyramid builders, the blocks get bigger. So what you've clearly got is the engineers are shifting material, but at that point they don't want to change their technique. They don't want to risk changing two things at once. But then you find that the next pyramid to be built has got slightly larger blocks, and by the time you get to the century on and they're building the really, really gigantic pyramids, they are adopting blocks much, much larger, which are far more efficient, and they've learnt how to make use of them. The other thing about the step pyramid, if you're showing here, is the way that it brings together what had previously been two separate entities. See, there's a big rectangular enclosure there, and then there's the pyramid with the burial underneath it in the centre. At Abydos, which had previously been the principal cemetery, the burial was about a kilometre or kilometre and a half away from the enclosure. So, for example, Kharsekemwy, Djoser's father, built a great mud brick enclosure at Abydos, but his tomb was a couple of kilometres away, completely separated from it. So not only does the step pyramid create the first stone building, it also combines in one location what had previously been two separate ones. And that separation of the great enclosure from the actual tomb goes back to the beginning of Egyptian history, back in Narmer's day. So yeah, what you've got there is the burial element of it, and Kharsekemwy is tomb V on the far left. But then if we then go east for a couple of kilometres, we end up with these enclosures. So there's a major conceptual size and engineering jump happens with Djoser, and traditionally that's all been put down. Traditionally that's all put down to his right hand man, a man called Imhotep. And we know from contemporary material, Imhotep is a really, really important person at Djoser's court. And then later, much, much later on, Imhotep becomes a god of medicine and all kinds of things, and is sort of regarded as being sort of the originator almost of Egyptian architecture. There's one much, much later architect, 2,000 years later, who tries to show that he is actually a descendant of Imhotep.
Interesting. So this was not a pharaoh.
No, here's basically this is a senior official.
He's the first architect.
As far as his titles don't include the one we normally translate as architect, but his contemporary ones, he's chancellor, maker of stone vases. But again, at that period, the standard set of titles hasn't really come about. Yeah, just what you've just shown there the previous one, that one on the drawing I'm talking about, which you had. That's that one, yeah. Because what you've got here is on the right are the names and titles of Djoser himself. On the left is the statue base which had the king on it. On the left are the titles of Imhotep. And the idea of having a non-royal person named on a royal statue is almost unheard of. So this does really indicate that Imhotep was amazingly close to the king. And also, when this was found in 1927, it verified what later legend had. Because if you jump forward 2,000 years, Imhotep and Djoser are a double act, that you find them in various later stories and so on. And it was wondered whether Imhotep, again, was a real person or not, because there was a 2,000-year gap between the first mention of him in Egyptian records, and then suddenly in 1927, this statue base is found, and suddenly Imhotep jumps from being legend to being a real person, exactly where legend said he was. So it's one of those. It's very much like sort of finding, a record of King Arthur, a contemporary record of King Arthur in some castle in Britain, rather than him simply being a legend. So, yeah, Imhotep, really, really important figure.
Okay, I want to keep on going into the sort of the fourth dynasty, and this is when the sort of the Great Pyramid of Giza is built. Who are the major characters from this period that define it?
Right. The key figure is really Sneferu, who is Khufu's father, Khufu being the builder of the Great Pyramid, because Sneferu's reign really marks a watershed in Egyptian history. Because prior to this, although we've got material, we can't, for example, trace holders of a single government office through generations. We've just got odd mentions of them. From Sneferu onwards, we can basically trace the history of most of the key government posts. We have got we've got tombs of every single pharaoh, possibly only one or two exceptions, which wasn't the case prior to that. So there is something about the reign of Sneferu which marks a great leap forward. The amount of archaeological material massively increases. So the amount of written material increases. It also seems that the level of literacy has increased, because although we have hieroglyphs and writing going back to 3000 BC, it's not until Sneferu, around about 2500 BC, that we start finding fully formed inscriptions, ones which go on for line after line as a coherent thing. So yes, Sneferu is the sort of the starting off point of all this, and also he builds no fewer than 3 pyramids as well, which makes him the greatest pyramid builder of all time. It doesn't seem to be that he was intending to have 3. You need one pyramid, but starts off by building the Meidum pyramid here, which was meant to be a stepped pyramid. Then there is some conceptual change, and pointy pyramids become the thing to have. And therefore he temporarily abandons the Meidum pyramid and builds what turns out to be the bent pyramid. That then seems to suffer a structural problem, and to reduce the weight of masonry, they move to complete it at a lower level. But at that point, he then seems to go back to Meidum and convert it to a true pyramid, in case he dies before a bent pyramid conversion is complete. And then, finding himself still alive, apparently, he then builds a 3rd pyramid in which he was actually buried, which is this one on the screen here, which is the Red Pyramid at Djoser, and in which we've found some fragments of what seems to be his mummy.
Can I ask a really basic question? Because, I mean, this is the stuff for sort of like YouTube and social media lore, where there's all these philosophies about why they built all these pyramids and conspiracies. But from your perspective, as somebody who's written 30 books about this, why did they spend all this time, energy, and money on these massive structures?
It was all to produce most efficient magical machine to move the dead king from being a dead body to being a god, effectively. It's the same as every Egyptian tomb. There's a magical machine for getting yourself from this world to the next. And the question of what you build is something to say what to do with your ego. I think there's something about the early 4th dynasty where there seems to be a triumphalism about showing what they can do, and hence, Sneferu is happy to put all the resource into building no fewer than 3 pyramids. Although, so one can argue on engineering grounds why he changed them. Then you've got under Khufu, the engineers, probably with all the experience having built 3 pyramids, are going for the best thing they can ever do. So they're going to produce the Great Pyramid. But after that, it seems that they start thinking, well, we've done that bit. We've done the sort of the mega pyramid. And what we then find is that the resources which had previously been put into building the biggest thing possible, and one suspects that probably when they'd built the Great Pyramid, they realised we can't really do anything bigger than this. This is probably the limits of what we can actually do in our engineering. What you then start seeing is an interesting transition whereby the resources don't go so much into a mega pyramid, but those resources get moved into building a more beautifully larger and more beautifully decorated temple complex attached to it. Because throughout, the pyramid is never a sort of a freestanding thing all on its own. It's part of a much larger entity. And there's always temples attached. Going back to Djoser, the style changes when you get to Sneferu, but basically the concept is the pyramid is the thing which is sheltering the body, but then directly attached are a complex of temples. And then as we move on through the Old Kingdom history, we can always graph the size of the pyramid drops off as the size of the temple gets bigger, and also the amount of decoration applied to the temple also gets bigger. So they're moving the resources around. And so I think very much that the engineers of the early 4th dynasty were trying to say, hey, we can do this. And once they'd done it, you probably couldn't get beyond that. There's also a rather interesting one about sort of visibility and so on, because Khufu's successor, Djedef-Re, built a much smaller pyramid, but he built it on top of a mountain. So that actually, it's far more visible.
He has a head start.
Exactly, because so actually the top of it is higher than his father's. And actually you look down from Djedef-Re's pyramid down to the Great Pyramid. And also, one of the things about Djedef-Re's pyramid, it's now very, very badly ruined. There's only a couple of courses left. But actually you can see it for absolutely miles. I was in Egypt a couple of weeks ago and we were coming back to Cairo from the north, coming down from Alexandria. And you could see this thing, even though it's only a stump about 15 foot tall now. You could see it from 20, 30 miles away. And you can't see the Great Pyramid until you're virtually on top of it. So so this is another sort of thing about what they're trying to do. They're trying to make a point. And it says Djedef-Re's pyramid. You can't see much of it, even on the ground. But if you're 20 miles away, you can see it, even in that kind of denuded state. So you can imagine what it was like when it was complete. Also, Djedef-Re decided to make it more luxurious. The Great Pyramid is just covered with polished limestone. Djedef-Re's pyramid was covered with polished granite. So it was so he'd used the resources in a different kind of way. And I think that emphasises the point about a pyramid. It's got its functional, magical reasons, but also it's to say, hey, I am the big I am here.
Okay, I want to continue and go into the 6th or 5th or 6th dynasty and talk about religion. When did religion sort of become more and more important and sort of in society? I mean, you mentioned the point of this structure was it was this magical transportation device. Those are religious beliefs. So what was the religious structure or sort of religious landscape?
Down to about 2300 BC, we don't really know is the answer. The data, the data is almost non-existent. We have the odd mention of gods, but not in any kind of sort of clear context. The one thing which is quite clear is that the sun cult is fundamental, and it's quite likely that the transition from having stepped pyramids in the 3rd dynasty to pointy pyramids in the 4th dynasty is to do with the elevation of the sun cult to be the principal one. Because although the Egyptians never bothered telling us what a pyramid is all about, one of the theories about it is effectively it's petrified sun's rays. And we know that the fetish of the sun god is either a pyramidal or conical stone. And therefore, the likelihood that a pyramid is simply a giant version of this fetish of the sun god seems likely. And actually, when you're actually at Giza around the Great Pyramid on a cloudy day, and you see the sun sort of just breaking through the clouds. It comes down in a cone, virtually the same angles as the pyramids. So although we can't be sure about it, we think it's quite likely that this pyramidal form is effectively a fetish of the sun. And also what's interesting is that from the reigns of Khufu's sons onwards, every Egyptian king, with only a couple of exceptions, has the sun god's name incorporated in his. So it looks as though part of whatever's going on in the Fourth Dynasty, it includes a massive elevation of the sun cult, and that is the reason why we now get pointy pyramids, and so on. So the sun cult is key. We don't really get anything useful about other gods until the end of the Fifth Dynasty, and that's because under a king called Unas, who is the last king of the Fifth Dynasty, we start finding what we call the pyramid texts inside the pyramids. Because prior to this, apart from some very unusual things in the pyramid of Djoser, the interiors of pyramids were completely undecorated. Then suddenly, under Unas, we get this huge quantity of text covering almost every inch of the interior of the pyramid. From the point of view of actually understanding what religion actually isn't helped by the fact that they're rather scattergun. And in fact, at no point is there such a thing as Egyptian religion in the sense of what we would say being able to define Christianity or Islam or Judaism. We can define what that is. If you believe X, Y, and Z, you are one of these. In Egypt, and actually much of the ancient world, religion was a much more sort of pick and mix kind of situation.
Sure.
And so moving much later on, that philosophical texts talk about you and your God, rather than saying which God you're interested in. And the pyramid texts are rather like that. They're a grab bag of what seems to be almost every text they could find in the library, and they just throw them at the wall. They have broadly to do with the aiding of the dead king's future in the next world, but it's very inconsistent about actually what he's doing. Is he being just being a member of the council of the gods? Is he being the secretary of the gods? What's he actually doing? There's a very weird one where he's apparently killing and eating the gods.
Jeez.
Which is very, very weird. And also that no two pyramids have the same selection of texts either. There's a core which most of them have, but out of the half dozen or so royal pyramids which have the pyramid texts, there is no two with exactly the same set. However, what these texts do, it indicates that by this time, around 2300 BC, a lot of the gods who we know from later periods are there. Osiris, who becomes the king of the dead, although whether he is actually king of the dead at that point is not so clear, and various other gods are in there. So we know that most of the standard cast of Egyptian gods are in a part of religion at that point, but quite how they relate to one another isn't made clear in there. And indeed, when we move later on and we do actually have more detailed mythological texts, there's a lack of consistency between them. We've got some examples where in one location, a god may be somebody's father. In another location, they could be their grandson. So there's a complete lack of coherence around this.
Yeah.
And it all seems to be that it all probably goes back to the whole fact that Egypt originally was a whole set of separate entities, and after the unification there was some kind of rationalization, and there are certainly certain gods who everybody recognizes, but there's also dozens or hundreds of little various mini gods and things like that only actually are worshipped in one little village in the middle of nowhere. So there's some really interesting stuff going on there.
Okay, I'll ask you a question, and then I'm going to use that to zoom forward. Who were the main female pharaohs, and what should we know about them? And then I want to talk to you about Nefertiti for sure.
There is a legendary first female pharaoh called Nitocris, who is supposedly somewhere around 2100 BC. But we're not quite sure whether she's real or legendary. The first real female pharaoh who we know definitely lived and reigned is a woman called Nefertiti. She reigns at the end of the 12th dynasty, so we're talking about the sort of 17th century BC, somewhere to 18th century BC. She reigns for something like 4 years. She seems to be the daughter of King Amenemhat III, who in turn seemed not to have had any sons, and was originally promoting one of his other daughters to be the first female pharaoh, but she dies prematurely. Then when he dies, a male pharaoh does come to the throne for a while, who seems not to be his son, and then Sneferu becomes king for the last bit of for the last few years of the 12th dynasty. We know very little about her. We've only got a couple of broken statues of her, but she certainly is there as being the first female pharaoh. And iconographically, she is shown as a woman, but wearing king's regalia over the top of her. And that's the statue just on the right of that. Just if you want to go back up to where you were, there's a broken statue. That's it. That statue there on the right there. That shows her wearing normal female gear, but then with raw kingly stuff over the top. After her, the kingdom goes back to being with a male pharaoh once again, and we don't find any more female pharaohs until the 18th dynasty, which is from the sort of 15th century onwards. There we have 2 female pharaohs. One of them is Hatshepsut, who initially is in control as the regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, but then probably at the point where Thutmose is about to become old enough to rule on his own, she is proclaimed female pharaoh, and then she rules alongside Thutmose III for just a little over a decade. Iconographically, she's interesting because she's sometimes shown wearing female clothing. In some cases, she's shown with a rather sort of halfway house kind of body, halfway between male and female. And in others, she is shown as a male. And you can only tell that she's a female ruler because in the texts, her titles have the feminine ending, which is a T in ancient Egyptian. So, but otherwise, sometimes with other representations, you wouldn't know it was a woman if you couldn't read the hieroglyphs. And that led to a lot of confusion in the early days of Egyptology when she was rediscovered. The next one who's really only become recognised in the last 30 or 40 years, is Nefertiti, who is the co-ruler during the last years of King Akhenaten's reign, and probably also during the first couple of years of Tutankhamun's reign, his successor.
Yeah.
A lot of debate over her origins, but I think the majority of Egyptologists, although I should point out that Egyptologists are amazingly argumentative and we don't really agree about many things, but certainly I and probably about 80% of the people who deal with this period are happy that she was originally Nefertiti, who was the wife of Akhenaten, who he then promotes to female pharaoh during his last years. And the final female pharaoh that we know of is a couple of centuries further on, a woman called Tawosret. She also starts off as the regent for a young king, Siptah, at the end of the 19th dynasty. But on his death, she then takes power as female pharaoh for a couple of years before then being overthrown by a rival. So you've got basically these are the female pharaohs who we know of. It's possible there may have been others, but these are the only ones we've actually got records of.
Okay, so I want to talk about Nefertiti. What do you think people most misunderstand about that figure, and why was Why was she an important figure to know? Why do 8-year-olds around the world know that name?
It's largely due to one discovery, which is of the painted limestone bust of her in 1912, which, from the moment it was discovered, was recognised as being a supreme work of art. And as a result, after it was put on public display in 1924, it sort of went around the world. So therefore, she is held up as being an icon of beauty. There she is. There's all these representations, and of course that has then been used. That image has been used for other things. There are people I've seen wearing jewellery of this head who've got no idea who it is, but they know it's an iconic image.
Yeah,
and it's a pity in some ways that the beauty of this piece has rather eclipsed what we can see, what we're now understanding about her political position, because now that we recognise that she did actually transition to being pharaoh as Nefertiti, which is only something which we've worked out in the last 20 or 30 years, suddenly it becomes clear that she is an important figure in the negotiation of the transition from the religious revolution of her husband, Akhenaten, who basically abolished Egyptian religion in favour of a new sun god, to bringing back the old ways under Tutankhamun. So, and it now seems quite clear to me, anyway. I say there are other ideas that she is the crucial figure in that transition from one to the other. And the trouble is, of course, that there's always a time lag in the understanding of people like this. That the history of ancient Egypt has changed fundamentally over the last 200 years. And even in a decade, a lot of the subtleties can change quite considerably. So unfortunately, everybody's picture of Nefertiti really is from 50 years ago, where it's just she is this glamorous figure. She's just the wife of a king. The understanding now that she actually probably is also a pharaoh, she is a mover and shaker politically, is something which unfortunately will probably take another 50 years to fully bed in amongst people outside the subject. And even within the subject, Egyptology we have lots and lots of subdivisions. So there's only actually a few of us who actually are genuinely experts on Nefertiti. Most Egyptologists have got interests in other periods as well. So even within Egyptology, it's been sometimes a bit of a struggle to get people to understand that the Nefertiti who the Nefertiti experts see today isn't the Nefertiti who was in standard textbooks 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Okay, I have two more questions for you. The first is, I was thinking about the discovery of the tomb of, I'll say it the way I was taught to say it when I was a child, Tutankhamun, but I'm sure what's the right pronunciation?
It's Tutankhamun. Because it's Tutankhamun.
Tutankhamun.
Because
okay.
Tut, Ankh, and Amun are separate entities. Tut means the image, Ankh means living, and Amun is the name of the god. So it's the living image of Amun, effectively, is what it translates as. It breaks up into three distinct syllables.
Tutankhamun. So I'd always heard about this discovery, this incredible discovery. So this brings me to my question, which is, what are the sort of 5 moments in the history of Egyptology that you wish you were there for? Like some incredible discovery, some dramatic moment where you just wish you could be a fly on the wall when this happened?
Ooh, actually, that's an interesting one. I suppose one would have been something which we've already talked about, which is the discovery of the Narmer Palette at Hierakonpolis in 1898. Because when they opened that little cache of material, suddenly we were catapulted back 300 years from where we ever had been prior to that. So I think that's certainly one of those points I would have loved to have been present for. Although it is cliched, I think probably opening Tutankhamun's tomb has to be another of those. The ability to look into a completely intact royal tomb, something which nobody had ever dreamt they would ever do.
Can you tell a little bit of the story of?
Okay, well, Tutankhamun's tomb was found in 1922. Over the previous few decades, the Valley of the Kings, the place where Egyptian kings had been buried basically between about 1500 BC and about 1100 BC, had gradually been examined. A number of tombs have been open since antiquity. Others were then discovered archaeologically starting at the end of the 18th century. And by the time we get to the 1920s, there's only a couple of them which have not been discovered. And the current team working there, led by Howard Carter, funded by the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, has been working there for a number of seasons. And Carter is very keen, before they give up, to make sure they've cleared everything, because there's still little bits of the valley which haven't been cleared. Carnarvon they've not found anything particularly spectacular, is keen on dropping everything, but Carter then says, "Look, let's just give us one more season," and it's on the second day of that one more season that they find the entrance to the tomb of Tutankhamun, because it's actually in a location which was deeply buried by flood debris back in antiquity, and so hadn't been, unlike some of the other tombs all the other tombs had been robbed in ancient Egyptian times. It had been so deeply buried that by the time there was a breakdown in law and order and these royal tombs were being robbed big time, it was just deeply buried and you required to do proper excavation to find it. And he managed to find it. And over a period of 10 years, they gradually emptied the tomb, with the material going up to Cairo, and it's now been beautifully redisplayed in the new Grand Egyptian Museum there as well. So the important point was that nobody had found a completely intact Egyptian king before. Some burials had been found with bits and pieces. In some of the pyramids, for example, they found arms, legs, and heads sort of strewn everywhere from robbers, but nothing before that. So this was the thing. It gave us our first vision of what a king of the 14th century BC, which is probably the richest and most cultured period of Egyptian history, what that looked like. So really, really important from all those points of view.
Okay, let's go back to the list. What else is on that list?
My third one is probably very similar, because in 1939, another intact royal tomb was found at Tanis in northern Egypt. Although those tombs are by no means as well preserved, because Tanis in the north of Egypt is rather damp, and pretty well all that survived was the precious metal of the burials. But again, a really interesting one to find that. And actually, for my next one, I probably would I'm going to jump back in time, back to the 1850s, which is when Auguste Mariette found the Serapeum, which was the burial place of the sacred Apis bulls. The Apis bull is the avatar of the god Ptah of Memphis. And he goes way, way back to the earliest times. In fact, I think I mentioned earlier on that under the reign of Den in the First Dynasty, we have a representation of him for the first time. But then, jumping forward from, about 2900 BC, then jumping forward to about 1350 BC, they start burying these bulls in a ceremonial manner. And there's this amazing catacomb of the bulls, which was found in the 1850s. As for my fifth sort of desire to be a fly on the wall of, that's slightly more problematic, because there's so many different possibilities there, and I'm not sure I can really sort of come up with one particular. I could, that's a problematic. My fifth one, I'm not sure. I have to take a rain check on that one.
Okay. The last question I want to ask you before we leave is related to the idea of empire. Two of your books are about different dynasties. The Libyan pharaohs, Nubian dynasties. Sudan is very famously has more pyramids than Egypt does. So I'm always curious about the relationship of sort of the center of ancient Egypt and these other different parts of it.
Yeah, the relationship between Egypt and Nubia is a really interesting one. And if you go back far enough into prehistory, it looks as though effectively Nubia, which effectively is the southern part of modern Egypt and the northern part of modern Sudan, was culturally very much part of southern Egypt. However, from the point of once you get unification of Egypt proper, the relationship seems to be much more of an imperial one, in that the Egyptians, the now unified Egyptians, start looking down on the Nubians and start regarding them as being a group to be subordinated. Also, as looking on Nubia more as a source of resources, because there's two ways that Nubia is a resort. There's what actually comes from Nubia itself. The deserts of Nubia were rich with gold, and so gold mines and things, that's important. Also, there's a number of stones which don't exist in Egypt, which are in Nubia. So if you're looking at certain kind of exotic sculptural material, you get it from there. But also, Nubia is a conduit for trade from deeper into Africa. So therefore, when you look later on at sort of the products of Nubia, it's a mixture of stuff which actually comes from Nubia and stuff which is clearly being traded from way, 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 way farther south. Giraffes and things like that, which never, as far as we can tell, ever lived in Nubia proper. And so what we then see for the most of Egyptian history are various attempts at controlling Nubia to a greater or lesser degree. Then in the Middle Kingdom, from about 1900 BC, the whole of the northern part of Nubia, effectively the part of Nubia which is now part of Egypt, becomes formally controlled by Egypt. And there are extensive fortresses built on what is now the Sudanese frontier, which are partly to protect Egypt from any raids from the south, but also they're great entrepot. And there's a stele which basically says that Nubians aren't allowed to come north of this point except to trade at some of these fortresses. And then it all changes again in the New Kingdom after 1500 BC, because during the in-between, this is what we call the Second Intermediate Period, where the north of Egypt was controlled by Palestinians, the south was being controlled at times by the Nubians, the Egyptians then decide to conquer the whole of Nubia. And from about 1500 BC onwards, Nubia is a province of Egypt. It's got its own viceroy, and basically the whole northern part of Sudan is that, and it's controlled directly by Egypt. Then, around 1000 BC, Egypt undergoes a major collapse of economy, power, and everything else, and Nubia becomes independent again. And this is where the tables get turned. While Egypt is going through a few bad centuries, we call the Third Intermediate Period, with civil wars and all sorts of other problems, Nubia is creating a new state, effectively. Very much modelled on Egypt, because it's been an Egyptian colony for centuries, so their basic idea of how does a state work, it's the Egyptian state. And then, finally, they get their act together in the 8th century BC and start expanding northwards, until by the middle of the 8th century, they control not only the whole of Nubia, but also most of southern Egypt as well. And then the next step is for them to become the overlords of the whole of Egypt. And this is where the Nubian Pharaohs come in. From Shabbataka onwards, although there still remain various little local rulers in Egypt, the Nubian pharaoh is the over king of everything. And so for a number of decades, the Nubians are in control of the whole of Egypt as well as the whole of Nubia. It's the first time that everything has been controlled like that for centuries. And then it's all brought to an end by the Assyrians. The Assyrians invade during the early 7th century BC, and the Nubians then retreat back into Nubia, never to sort of be to return to Egypt again. So there's this really interesting point where the whole of millennia, effectively, of looking down on the Nubians and seeing them purely as colonial fodder, if you like, suddenly there is this few decades where the Nubians come back on top. But then the Assyrians come in and Nubia. But it's at that point, really, that when Nubia starts building all these pyramids, that once they take over Egypt, they decide to start building pyramids. And even when long after they've departed from Egypt, they carry on building them. So the Nubian pyramids start off in the 8th century BC and finish in the 4th century AD. So it's probably the longest single span of pyramid building in history.
Amazing. Okay, that sounds to me like it should be a separate episode. So maybe let's leave it there. If you're interested, there are, as I mentioned, dozens of books available that Aidan's written. I need to ask you how you're able to be so productive and prolific, but we'll take that conversation offline. Aidan, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.